Well, welcome to episode 311 of 10 Minute Record Reviews. And this time I'm going to talk about this record by Benny Golson, Benny Golson's New York Scene, his debut record on Contemporary, released in 1959. This is a first pressing, which I found at Beat Street Records in Vancouver, which is, if you're in Vancouver, a phenomenal record store, which has a huge used jazz selection. I didn't actually get paid for this plug, but I am feeling guilty because I did get this copy for $35 at Beat Street, and it's actually worth considerably more. So sorry, Beat Street, and thank you. So Benny Golson, still going at 93, was a major, if probably underappreciated, figure in the world of jazz from the mid-1950s until the early 1960s. He grew up in the era of the big bands, he cut his teeth in a number of jazz orchestras, and became known as both an exponent of hard bop tenor, but also as a prolific composer. In his career, he's never really wavered from being an exponent of hard bop. And in fact, in the 1960s, during the free jazz explosion, he retreated from the jazz world and went to Hollywood and composed TV and film scores, returning to performing in the 1970s. This, as I mentioned, is his debut as a leader, and as it's a collaboration with Art Farmer, it marks probably the first step towards what would eventually become the Jazz Tet, which flew the flag for mainstream jazz in the early 60s era of Coleman, Coltrane, and Dolphy. It's not a perfect record, but it has its moments, and it's an impressive start to Golson's career as a leader, and in fact, really to the Jazz Tet era. Benny Golson was born in January 1929 in Philadelphia, and he's part of that tremendous cohort of jazz musicians born in Philly in the late 1920s and the 1930s. He's raised by his mom, who's a single mother. The family did not obviously have a lot of money, but she makes a priority of Benny's musical talents. At age 9, he starts on the piano, and then a few years later, he goes to see Lionel Hampton and his orchestra at the Earl Theatre in Philadelphia, and there he is blown away by Arnett Cobb playing the saxophone on Hampton's hit song, Flying Home. From that point on, he's glued to the radio listening to saxophone solos, and when his mom realizes this, she goes out and she buys him a brand new saxophone, a tenor sax, which she couldn't really afford, but she buys it on installments. He starts to play and to play with other people around his age who are getting into music, and a friend of his says, "Hey, I know another guy in school, a couple of years older than you, who also plays the sax. Let me introduce you." Well, it turns out this guy is John Coltrane. So Coltrane comes over to Golson's house, and they practice at his house. Now, Golson's mom used to hide upstairs when Golson was practicing, just not comment, but I guess Golson plays something, and then Coltrane shows up and plays something, and I guess she sticks her head out the window and says, "Who was that?" Well, it's Train, Mom. And along with Coltrane, he gets his first serious musical gig with a local band called Jimmy Johnson and the Ambassadors. Neither of them last long. They're fired. They're fired in a way which is kind of sneaky. They were told the gig had been canceled, but his mom said, it probably wasn't canceled. Just go and check it out. So they went and checked it out, and sure enough, they'd been replaced. They came home really sad, and she says, "Look, don't worry, one day you'll be so famous they can't afford you." Prescient. Mom knows. He and Coltrane, when they could scrape together the money, would also go to New York to try and find their heroes. They would listen in doorways to Charlie Parker playing saxophone because they were underage. They once also bumped into Monk in Harlem outside the Apollo, and they wanted to be cool and ask him if there were any great gigs coming up, but he misunderstood them and said, "You kids are too young for dope." After school in 1947, Golson goes off to Howard University to study music. They didn't offer any courses in jazz, so it was all classical, and he studied performance, not composition, and he stays until 1950. At that point, he's desperate to get out and hit the road and play, and in his own words, he becomes unfortunately entangled in R&B at that time, joining a band led by a guy called Benjamin Bull Moose Jackson, called Bull Moose Jackson and his Buffalo Bearcats, which I think is 4 animals in one title. This was not exactly musical Valhalla, but there was one great attribute that this band had, which was that the piano player was a guy called Tad Dameron, a wonderful composer. And with Dameron in the same band, Golson learns all about composition, and when Dameron forms his own band and takes it to New York in 1953, Golson goes along with him. That Dameron band also had Clifford Brown on trumpet. Golson then goes on over the next few years to have a whole bunch of stops in different bands, including those run by Jimmy Tyler, Johnny Hodges, and that was a gig which Coltrane got him, Earl Bostic, Dizzy Gillespie, and then eventually Art Blakey's Jazz Messengers. He appears on many recordings during this period in the mid-1950s, including records by Dameron and by Gillespie. Most famously, he appears on only one record with Art Blakey, but it's a very famous record. It's Monin, and he actually composes 4 of the 6 tracks on that classic hard bop outing. And it wasn't only in Blakey's band that he made a dent as a composer. Other people who recorded his tracks included Lee Morgan, Dizzy Gillespie, in whose band, of course, he was playing, Thad Jones, Paul Chambers, and a lot of his compositions ended up becoming standards, like Whisper Not, which appears first on this record. He also ends up providing Miles Davis with one of the very first tracks that Miles would record with his first great quintet. Coltrane had been with Miles for about a week. and Golson and Coltrane are chatting, and Golson says, "How's it going with Miles?" And Coltrane says, "Pretty good, but Miles needs new music to record. Have you got anything written?" Golson had lots of things written, but he decided just to give Coltrane one track to take to Davis, which was Stablemates. And a little while later, Coltrane says, "Well, guess what? We recorded it," and it appears on the LP, The New Miles Davis Quintet. But perhaps the greatest success that Golson had as a composer around this time was I Remember Clifford, composed very shortly after his good friend Clifford Brown dies in a car accident in 1956. It's a big success, partly because it's a tremendous tune, but also because Brown was very warmly remembered and esteemed by the whole New York jazz community, and as a consequence, it's recorded by all kinds of people. In these years, particularly beginning with his time with Dizzy Gillespie, Golson is becoming better and better known. He was a subject of praise and downbeat, and he begins to appear as a sideman on more and more records. In 1957, he appears on 7 different sessions for 6 different labels. He'd also struck up a friendship with the trumpeter Art Farmer, with whom he was regularly appearing in different sessions around New York. And eventually, it would lead to the two of them approaching each other about the same time and saying, "Hey, let's form a group, let's form a sextet." And that eventually took shape as the Jazztet, with Curtis Fuller and McCoy Tyner and others in 1960. But before then, they would each appear on a record led by the other. In late 1958, Art Farmer released an excellent record called Modern Art, which featured Golson. And this record, of course, features Farmer. And it's actually recorded well before Modern Art. It's recorded in the fall of 1957, but it's not released until January 1959. This record is made in New York at a studio I can't determine on October 14th and October 17th, 1957. One of those dates I suspect is used to record the quintet, and the other date is probably used to record the larger group of 9 musicians. Another thing I can't quite discover is exactly how this record comes to be released by Contemporary. Golson is based in New York, Contemporary is based in LA. He's never led a session before for anybody. He's never appeared on a Contemporary release. He never ever again appears on a Contemporary release. But if I can speculate, it may be that he came across Les Koenig, the supremo of Contemporary records, out in LA when he was touring out there with either Gillespie or Art Blakey. Anyway, however it happens, Les Koenig ends up contracting with Golson to make this record in New York. And for production duties, he taps Nat Hentoff, the downbeat critic and the well-known excellent writer of liner notes. Now, this is only the 4th session that Hentoff had ever produced in his career, and I think he had not produced one for 5 years by the time he stepped into the booth to make this. I don't know who the engineer was, and with all due respect to Nat, this does not hit the heights that Koenig and Roy Dunan would normally reach for their records for Contemporary. It still sounds pretty good, but there are here and there some miking issues which detract from a few tracks. Benny Golson's on tenor saxophone, Art Farmer's on trumpet. There are 2 players here from Miles Davis's orbit, Paul Chambers, the bassist, and Win Kelly, the piano player, and Charlie Persip is on drums. On Whisper Not, Just by Myself, and You're Mine You, these 5 are joined by 4 more horn players, Jimmy Cleveland on trombone, Julius Watkins on French horn, Gigi Grice on alto, and Sahib Shahab on baritone. The record starts with a version of Something in B Flat by Ray Bryant. The head arrangement features some excellent unison playing from Golson and Farmer, but this is one of the tracks that's kind of let down by the miking because Win Kelly's piano is not picked up very well, and Paul Chambers' arco bass playing, which one can only assume was excellent, is barely audible. Next is Whisper Not, which is the first track with a nonette. This, of course, would become a standard, and this particular version is memorable, at least for me, for Gigi Grice's fantastic Charlie Parker-esque alto solo. The final track on side 1 is Step Lightly, which is back to the quintet format. It's one of my 2 favorite tracks in this whole record. With Chambers' fantastic walking bass line, you can hear him a lot better in this track, and Farmer's muted trumpet. This is like quintessential mid-century jazz. Excellent. Swings, too. Side 2 starts with Just by Myself, which is another nonette track, and then we're into Blues It, which is probably my other favorite track in this record. It's a kind of a medium-paced blues, features a great Farmer solo, and then this really seamless transition into Golson. You're Mine You is a sole outright ballad on here, and it's a very sultry one featuring Golson's tenor. And the record concludes with Gigi Grice's tune Capri, which is a jaunty big band track, not that memorable to me. This is a record which, if not perfect, shows the sophistication of its main man because Golson's playing is excellent and his composition and arrangements are top-notch. It's also graced by the superb playing of Farmer, again effectively the co-leader. It's also, as I mentioned, slightly let down by the engineering. Don't be expecting to thrill to the playing of Paul Chambers, but if you're a hard bop fan, this is definitely one to seek out, and for me, it's 4 out of 5 stars.